Her lines were sleek and powerful. She was designed to kill, to seek out and destroy an enemy bomber. She was the most advanced, the most sophisticated weapon of war conceived and built in Canada. She was the Arrow. That was over 20 years ago. On a February day in 1959, the conservative government of John Diefenbaker canceled the Arrow program after 5 of the aircraft had flown. Today, there are no Arrows, only models, pictures, blueprints, and a few broken parts in a warehouse in Ottawa. And there is film of the Arrow in flight, smuggled out of the Avro aircraft plant near Toronto in defiance of a government order to destroy not just the plane, but seemingly all evidence of its existence. After 20 years, the Arrow is still remembered, and the questions remain. Why was it really canceled? And why did the government wish to eradicate its memory? The tragedy of the Arrow, like so many tragedies, began in hope and optimism. At the end of the war, Canada was in a position to become one of the world's leading manufacturers of aircraft. The Avro company, formed in 1945, was a symbol of faith in the future. We had been building Lancaster bombers for war. Now we would build both commercial aircraft for peace and fighters to protect the peace. The architects of this policy were a canny Canadian cabinet minister, C.D. Howe, and directors of the British aircraft firm Hawker Siddeley. Among them, Sir Roy Dobson, the hard-driving Lancashireman who had virtually created the Lancaster bomber and who now became Avro's first president. The company's first general manager, here on the right, was an impatient young Canadian, Fred Smythe. Avro brought together a talented team of young designers and engineers, many of them from England, like James Floyd. The age of the jet was beginning. But before the tragedy of the Arrow could unfold, another disaster was in the making. In 1946, the company embarked on its first project, a 4-engine passenger jet which they hoped to sell to TransCanada Airlines, later known as Air Canada. TCA was intrigued by the idea of being the first North American airline to offer a jet service. Intrigued and perhaps frightened. They were troubled by the jetliner. They didn't think they could make a profit on it, and eventually withdrew their support. The company then tried to market the plane in the United States. There was a triumphant publicity flight to New York, carrying the world's first jet airmail, and the New York Times said, "Uncle Sam has no monopoly on genius." Now, National Airlines ordered 4 of the aircraft, with an option on a further 6. It was too late. The Korean War had started, and C.D. Howe ordered Avro to put its whole production effort behind a new fighter for the RCAF. Howard Hughes leased the plane for 6 months and used it as a personal toy. In 1957, the same year Boeing captured the market with its 707, the jetliner was broken up into scrap. Between the jetliner and the Arrow, there was one success story, the CF-100. In 1949, Avro had begun work on a new fighter. The National Film Board chronicled its birth in screaming jets.
Behind locked doors, Avro Canada worked to fill a top priority order from the Air Force. And now the wraps are coming off Canada's hush-hush night fighter, the CF-100.
The CF-100 was a twin-engine, 2-man day and night fighter, the first built in Canada to the RCAF's own specifications. It was eventually to be powered by the company's own Arenda engines. With the failure of the jetliner, Avro were now dependent entirely on military contracts, and the stakes were high.
In the expectant stillness of the hangar, the men who built the plane are tense with excitement. Each man wonders, had they miscalculated somewhere, or will it scorch off beautifully into the sky?
Behind that sleek black question mark lay years of hard work and headaches for all of us.
And there were a few headaches to come. In 1951, the CF-100 was still a long way from its successful future. But it did bring into the company a handful of brilliant test pilots. Spud Potocki, a Polish air ace. Peter Cope from Gloucester Aircraft in England. Jack Woodman with the RCAF, who came later. And Jan Zurakowski. These were to be the only 4 men to fly the Arrow. Zurakowski could make the CF-100 do cartwheels in the air, and one day he even pushed it into a supersonic dive. But in 1951, another man was to have an impact on the fortunes of Avro and the Arrow. Crawford Gordon had been a protege of C.D. Howe's. At the age of 37, he came to the company as president and general manager. Together with Sir Roy Dobson, he built Avro into a complex of 39 companies. To Sir Roy, he was like another son, a son he would eventually disown. After Gordon's arrival, the CF-100 entered squadron service with the RCAF. Ultimately, Avro produced nearly 700 of them. But already the Air Force knew it needed something that would fly higher and faster to keep pace with the new Russian bombers. And in that knowledge was born the Arrow. In 1952, Avro came up with design studies for a new delta-wing aircraft. The CF-105 was to be a supersonic, twin-engine, 2-man interceptor, capable of engaging the enemy at 50,000 feet and carrying missiles and rockets. It was a whole new concept in fighter technology, and it pushed Avro's design team into finding solutions to problems never faced before. Jim Floyd was now Vice President of Engineering in charge of the overall design of the plane.
Problems were legion on the Arrow. We had a problem, for instance, at the wing skin temperatures at 50,000 feet, where the aircraft was to have its combat capability, were 40, 50 degrees higher than the boiling point of water. Yet inside of the wing you had the fuel which was cooling it down, so the differential temperature was trying to distort the wing. And we had to tailor and design the wing so that that distortion was compensated and didn't affect the aerodynamic capability of the aircraft.
There were to be no prototypes. Avro was going straight into a first batch of pre-production models, and testing was elaborate. Scale models were fired by rocket into Lake Ontario to test aerodynamic qualities. The CF-105 was now called the Arrow.
We had to be dead right first time. There was no flying a prototype, finding the problems on it, then reflecting that back into the production drawings and issuing modifications. You had to be right, and yet you had nothing to fall back on, no real experience to fall back on the design of this aircraft.
As the program developed, there were some unanswered questions that were to have a crucial bearing on the Arrow's fate. The RCAF had not completed studies on the weapon they wanted the plane to carry. Robert Lindley, chief technician, came up with an unusual solution.
One feature of the Arrow, the weapon bay, you may recall that the whole weapon bay would lower out of the airplane and go back in again. And I put that feature in there because I couldn't find out what weapon we were supposed to be carrying. So I said, okay, I'll solve the problem, you know, I'll make a detachable portion and take your time, make up your mind. When you're ready, we'll put it in there. And it was a nifty feature, I guess, in the end, but that's really why it was done.
While Lindley was coping with the unknown weapon system, the Arrow began to take shape on the factory floor. A workforce of some 14,000 men and women translated the engineering drawings into a reality of steel, aluminum, titanium, and miles of electric wire. And as the pace of work quickened, the liberal government of Louis Saint Laurent began to notice the mounting costs. In mid-1955, C.D. Howe told the House, "We have embarked on a program of development that gives me the shudders." The RCAF had now decided it wanted the Sparrow missile and the Astra fire control system, neither of them yet off the drawing boards in the United States. The Air Force wanted the best, and it was going to cost the country dearly. But it was not the liberals who were going to pay the bill. In June 1957, John Diefenbaker became Prime Minister of Canada at the head of a conservative government. And suddenly, Avro, created by the Liberals, found itself without friends in Ottawa. The Arrow was already a financial problem. Now, with hundreds of subcontractors dependent on the program, making everything from landing gear to delicate flight instruments, and with thousands of employees on the payroll, it was a political problem as well. On October the 4th, 1957, the Arrow made its first public appearance before an audience of dignitaries, Air Force officials, and workers. The Honorable George Perks, Minister of Defense in the new Conservative government, told his listeners that the coming missile age did not mean that the era of the manned airplane was over. The aircraft, he said, has this one great advantage over the missile. It can bring the judgment of a man into the battle. Even as the curtains parted and the Arrow was paraded into view, Russia was launching Sputnik, and the missile age was truly begun. The argument, which Perks dismissed, was within months to be used against the Arrow by his own Prime Minister. But on that day, the builders of the Arrow were counting the months and the weeks ahead until it should take flight.
I understand the Arrow will undergo high-speed taxiing tests within the next 3 weeks. But when will it fly?
It will fly sometime during the period that it's undergoing these high-speed taxi trials. You say within the next 3 weeks. This is when we would hope it will be doing its high-speed trials. And sometime during that period, it will fly.
And it did fly. On the 25th of March, 1958, Jan Zurakowski climbed into the cockpit of Arrow 201. He made a final instrument check, pressed open the throttles, and released the brakes. The Arrow was ready for takeoff.
Detection. I am coming in to take photographs. Stand by it.
Every maneuver of the plane was recorded by cameras on the ground and in the two chase planes, piloted by Jack Woodman and Spud Potocki.
Controls are behaving quite nicely. I can see no oscillatory motions of any description in them. I think all this, immediately the carriage is packed, all the vibration disappears. I think the carriage is making this. That's right, it's the side door which is making, the door which comes and closes the undercarriage in the way.
In flight, the Arrow performed like the thoroughbred she clearly was. All the attention to detail, all the elaborate test procedures of the past 5 years paid off in a flight that was virtually flawless.
I hope you're accelerating up to 250 now. Roger.
In the laconic voices of Zurakowski and his countryman Spud Potocki, veterans of the Polish Air Force in Britain 13 years before, you hear the routine communication of two professionals examining the behavior of a piece of machinery as if this test flight were the most normal event in the world.
The engines are behaving quite nicely. They are occasionally giving you a bit of a black puff of smoke coming out of them, Jan, but otherwise I can see there is no problem. That is Roger, Jan. As far as I can see from the back, no condition has changed. Switching out the dampers now.
Fuel readings, please, 201. The wind is northeast at 10, the altimeter is 020.
On that first flight of 35 minutes, Zurakowski took the plane to 11,000 feet. On succeeding flights, it was to reach easily its target of 50,000 feet at nearly twice the speed of sound. Workers and managers and Air Force personnel left their shops and offices to watch the return of Arrow 201. Some had even brought their families. Zurakowski was later to say that he had never test flown an aircraft with so few problems. But there was something else. Canadians, used to seeing the leadership in technology in the hands of the United States and Britain, were suddenly aware that they had something which looked like the best in the world.
And when Zora came down after this flight of this super airplane, and the snag sheet showed the malfunction of 2 electrical switches out of 4,000 or thereabouts, we weren't surprised. I'm not, I don't want to feel any arrogance about this, but the facts are we had done so much testing because of going straight into production that we had to be right. It was just unthinkable that anything could go radically wrong with that aircraft. And it was a very, very successful flight.
But first flight was very simple and very easy. From flying point of view, didn't present any problems.
You know, Zurakovsky never told you what the hell went on when you got him to fly an airplane. Because he flew them for himself, I think, not for you, but he was certainly a superb pilot, there's no question about it.
22 years ago, Reg Lane was a group captain in the RCAF attached to the Avro plant and the Arrow program. He recently retired as Brigadier General Lane, Deputy Commander of NORAD at Colorado Springs. He was one of the spectators in that crowd on the edge of the runway.
It was absolutely magnificent when that aircraft flew the first time, and the reports that were coming back from the test pilot and the various readouts of the test equipment that was on board the aircraft of the performance of the total machine. And of course, I think it was a second or third flight, I can't remember precisely, when it actually went through Mach 1. Now, that was a truly incredible accomplishment in those days, and at that stage of the design of modern jet airplanes. Truly phenomenal effort. Well, of course, everyone's spirits just rocketed when the initial reports came through on the first test flight of the airplane. And we knew that we had a winner.
It was a fantastic performing aircraft. I mean, Avro's commitment was to build an airplane that would give the Air Force 1.5 Mach. Our performance boys thought we could do 1.6 Mach with it. As it turned out, we actually flew that airplane to 1.9 Mach number. And had we continued development of the Iroquois engine powered airplane, we had a lighter engine for more thrust, and we had a 2.3, 2.4 Mach number potential. And in 1958, there wasn't another airplane in the world that was anywhere near being competitive with this airplane.
The project was just had a lot of national pride. You know, you just go home at night and people want to hear about it, and you tell them about it. I remember Bob Rice had a garage down the road from the airport, and he used to call me. I was taking off today, and I'd say, yeah, take what time? I said, I don't know, probably about 10 o'clock. And he'd be out in front of the garage with his people. He wouldn't serve anybody no gas, waiting for the airplane to take off and go over a gas station. For the airplane, that's what everybody wanted, you know. It was something they could look at and say, hey, that's what we did in this country, and I think it was terrific.
Through the summer of 1958, Arrows 201, 202, and 203 chalked up 57 flights, totaling some 61 hours. Each flight provided valuable lessons about the plane's capabilities. 204 made 6 flights beginning in October, and 205 flew only once on the 11th of January, 1959. But by that time, the Arrow was already under sentence of death. In the summer of 1958, General Perks and Finance Minister Donald Fleming had made an official visit to NORAD headquarters in Colorado. The American plan for North American defense included Canadian fighter squadrons, the radar warning system, and the Beaumark missile. Perks now became convinced that the bomber was becoming obsolete, that if Russia were going to attack North America, it would do so with nuclear missiles. The Arrow would be useless against such an attack. If fighters were needed, he now had assurances from the Americans that the United States could make them available in quantity. The logic of this was not lost on his colleague, the Minister of Finance.
The plane was becoming much more expensive to construct than had ever been expected in the first place. Indeed, originally, thinking in terms of manufacturing a much larger number of planes. The cost had been estimated down as low as $1 million a copy. Well, because of the disappearance of the hoped-for market, the cost was getting up to figures between $8 million and $12.
In September 1958, the first blow fell. The Prime Minister announced that because of the rapid development of missiles, the government was not going to complete the full Arrow program. Crawford Gordon chose to believe the Arrow would not be canceled.
I want to stress most emphatically that the Arrow program has not been canceled, nor has it been decided not to put it into production. On the contrary, the Prime Minister's statement says the program is to continue. As it now stands, it involves the building of 37 aircraft and an appropriate number of engines. This situation remains unchanged, and we are convinced that when the review takes place next March, the Arrow will be ordered into production.
There was no change in government policy since the announcement.
But General Perks spelled it out. The Sparrow missile and Astra fire control systems were to be dropped. Work would continue on the 37 pre-production models, and that was all.
Everybody in the country buried the Arrow. They said it was all finished and so on, but we weren't prepared to accept that, and we went about our business to try to find out. We spoke to the political people in Ottawa on the one hand and the military on the other, and got two completely opposite.
Now the company mounted a desperate campaign to reverse the decision. Fred Smyth went to Washington to see the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force and extracted from him an extraordinary commitment. The U.S. Air Force was willing to fund the missile and fire control system, as well as supplying test facilities as a virtual gift to the Government of Canada. And he authorized Smyth to communicate this to the Minister of Defense Production, Raymond O'Hurley.
On the next day, I went to Mr. O'Hurley with a letter to this effect, and I stood there while he read it. And that was the last we heard of that.
No trace of that letter can be found in the National Archives. We have independent corroboration that it existed, but no evidence that it was ever seen by the Minister of National Defense, for example. Indeed, Mr. Perks later denied that there had been any offer of financial help from the Americans. If an air of mystery hangs over many of the decisions in the Arrow story, it is because so many files are either incomplete or closed to the public for a 30-year period. In any case, it appears that the letter would have made no difference. The government had already made up its mind. February 20th, 1959. For the thousands of people who were thrown out of work that day, it would be known as Black Friday. More than 20 years later, the memories are still fresh and painful.
Well, about 9:30 in the morning, one of the fellows in the office telephoned his broker, just an ordinary inquiry on some stock prices. And toward the end of the conversation, he said, so by the way, how's Avro Canada doing today? Now you have to bear in mind that there was a tremendous feeling of pride of working at Avro Aircraft and the Doranda engines at that time. People really enjoyed it, and they bought stock in the company in the hopes that they would, succeed while the company succeeded. And at any rate, the broker said, no, let's see, Avro Canada. Oh, just a minute, there's something coming in over the ticker tape. And he waited a couple of minutes, came back, and he says, we've just got a thing over the ticker tape that says that the Canadian Prime Minister has just announced in the House of Commons that the Avro, Arrow, and Doranda Iroquois programs are to cease immediately. And that was the extent of the thing on the ticker tape. So the guy came back off the telephone, sort of quite shaken, obviously.
Be about 10:30, just after 10 in any event. As I stepped out in the hall, coming running down the corridor, very white in the face, was Joe Morley, who was my vice president of sales, followed by Alan Hoare, who was the DDP representative in the company. And Morley said, the Prime Minister has just announced in the House of Commons that the Arrow, the Iroquois, have been canceled.
2 hours later, around noon or after, Mr. Plant came on the loudspeaker system and said that everything had been canceled, every single contract the company had on the Arrow, and on the Iroquois engine. And he read the telegram, or cable, which was sent, and he said that under the circumstances, and with no other contracts to fall back on, of the kind that they had been pressuring the government to let them begin and take men off the Arrow to start work on, he had no alternative but to lay everyone off for the time being until they sorted out union priorities, seniority, and what jobs they could salvage that could keep a few people busy, and that they would be called back after this was sorted out.
When I got there, all the executives, the ones that were left, were all standing around there with a drink in their hand. This is 10 o'clock in the morning, and some were partly loaded. And Gordon, we were waiting for the telegram to arrive. We'd had it officially over the phone. And when it came, Gordon read it, and he handed it to me, and he said, "Somebody has got to take on that son of a bitch in Ottawa, and I'm just the one to do it."
Mr. Diefenbaker had said later that the abrupt dismissal of 14,000 people was an attempt to embarrass the government.
Well, we were only an agent of the government. Anyone with any knowledge of government contract procedure or industrial practice would know that we had no alternative. The men were to stop work then, and they weren't to be paid then. There were no further costs to be incurred as far as the government was concerned. So you tell me what you do with 13,000 people with nothing to do.
A sudden decision like this, it's going to cause panic in the place. That's for sure. I mean, whose side is he on? Is he trying to break he's trying to break the country, in my opinion. And $100 spent in this plant brings $65 back in taxes. That's been explained to all the public. He's going to give all those hundreds to the states. For why? Are they backing him?
I would just like to say that I feel Mr. Diefenbaker has sold his country and his fellow Canadians down the river to American interests.
I just have a couple of words to say to Mr. Diefenbaker. Be a Canadian, buy Canadian.
Brampton is probably typical of scores of other Canadian towns.
The cancellation created shockwaves in communities around the Avro plant. For CBC News, a young Morley Safer reported on its effects on the lives of workers and their families.
Pride themselves on their independence, but in fact, Brampton is dependent on one single industry. Small talk and gossip cover a single topic today: the end of the Arrow.
It's probably one of the more emotional sort of experiences I've had in my life, I think, in a sense, because I think partly because of the tremendous personal involvement of everybody who worked there. There was I mean, if you can imagine secretaries walking out from the design floor down the stairs, you know, with tears streaming down their faces and this sort of thing. And it wasn't just a few isolated ones, it was a lot of them, you know. It was a very sort of emotional upheaval, I think.
For weeks after that, people would wander into work just at a normal work time, just couldn't believe it had finished. You know, they'd walk around in days almost. They'd come in and sit at the boards and walk around just as if nothing had happened. And there were about 5, I don't recall the exact number, but there were about 5 of us left there, try and pick up the pieces and put the engineering together and package it and put it away so that it'd be left for posterity or burnt, maybe burnt.
And in fact, the saddest thing on Black Friday was that when we were in with the president of the company and we were holding a wake, if you like, on the announcement, and I couldn't believe it. I just went to, you know, almost was sick on the thing of what do we do with all these people and what do we do with my 1,500 engineers. My chief engineer came in, who had been preparing the 206, which had the Iroquois engine in for first flight. And he said, I've heard about the cancellation. Can I fly 206? In other words, can I continue with the preparation of 206 for flight? And after consultation with Johnny Plant, who was the president of the company, and the other directors, I just had to go and tell Bob Lindy, no, you can't fly that aircraft. So in fact, the aircraft, which would have bettered the specification, was a phenomenal aircraft, an all-Canadian project with a Canadian airframe, Canadian engine, never flew.
In a warehouse in Ottawa is all that remains of Arrow 206, the plane that never flew. There are those who believe that with the Iroquois engine, it would have set world records for altitude and speed. And the Iroquois? It's now an exhibit in the Aeronautical Collection in Ottawa. There is no plaque to identify it. It seems a curious way to honor our achievements. And we still ask the question, what finally killed the Arrow?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer. I felt personally, even though I was involved with it, the program should never have been started in Canada in the first place because it was just too expensive for us. However, it was started, and if they'd maintained it at its original idea, this might have gone through. But then when they added the cost of developing the Sparrow 2 and the cost of an Astra fire control system, this just added to the cost. And if they hadn't been added, whether this would have made a difference, I don't know. But the other thing is that if the two opposing people, and let's face it, there was a lot of personalities involved in the cancellation of Mr. Diefenbaker and Crawford Gordon. And if either one of those two people had been different, and preferably both of them, the cancellation could not have happened. I think it was a very personal thing on this, in the final cancellation of the Arrow.
Men of different temperament, different background. Gordon, contemptuous of the prairie lawyer who didn't understand industry. Diefenbaker, suspicious of the aggressive tactics of a Bay Street whiz kid. There were stories of a famous meeting in September of 1958.
Although I'd never met Mr. Diefenbaker, I knew he had great respect for his office, for the office of Prime Minister. And I warned Gordon before he went to see him not to take a drink and not to smoke in his office, whatever he did. Well, Gordon must have been very belligerent. He had his half loaded when he got there. And he puffed smoke in the old man's face all the time. And it ended in quite a bitter argument, and what you would use the term that the president was thrown out.
But, you know, what's that got to do with the air defense policy of the government of Canada? Whether or not Diefenbaker and Gordon had a personality clash, the only time they met was on that occasion, September the 17th, for about 20 minutes.
That was their only meeting?
Yes. And what's it got to do with the air defense policy of Canada, or the Arrow, or anything else?
I haven't any idea the real reason for the cancellation. So many reasons have been given. Mr. Diefenbaker even said that the Chief of Staff said he didn't want the airplane. Well, I don't believe that. I think the real reason for the cancellation was the fact that they weren't sure that it was going to cost what we thought it was going to cost. And secondly, that Mr. Diefenbaker wanted to save some money somewhere. What is going to be done with the money, I don't know. But it has been stated to me by a man who now past the Great Divide, who was in the know, that for about $50 million more than we'd already spent, plus the cancellation charges which we were going to spend, that we could have had as many Arrows as we had Voodoos.
2 years later, Canada took possession of 66 second-hand Voodoos bought from the Americans in a package deal. The Voodoo was vastly inferior to the Arrow, but the price was right. And what would C.D. Howe have done had the Liberals remained in power? In January 1959, he wrote to his leader, Lester Pearson, "There is no doubt in my mind that the CF-105 should be terminated. Costs are completely out of hand." In this, the Liberals and the Tories were in agreement.
It was an inevitable decision. No other decision under the circumstances could have been responsibly made. Had we done something else, it would have simply meant taxing the people of Canada to go on manufacturing planes for which there would never be a market outside Canada. And the Royal Canadian Air Force could only absorb so many. And as a matter of fact, it was around this time that the whole role of the fighter aircraft had to be re-examined, because our concept of the defense of Canada in relation to a possible attack changed from fear of the man bomber to fear of missiles. And the Avro Arrow would never have been any use to us as a defense against missiles.
Last September, I made it perfectly clear that having regard to the development that was then taking place, particularly in intercontinental ballistic missiles, that there was a probability that action would have to be taken in this regard. And that's the reason for the action. We were loath to take it.
The Prime Minister used not money, but the missile threat as the major reason for the cancellation. In place of the Arrow, we acquired the Beaumark missile from the United States.
The part that upset me was basically in being asked to give some rationale behind the decision other than cost. And we really couldn't do it because it was simply a cost matter. And then Mr. Diefenbaker making the statement that the introduction of the Beaumark was the reason for canceling the Arrow, that it was a better interceptor, if you will, and more effective, and therefore the Arrow could be canceled. That argument was a very specious one, and literally had no fact whatsoever.
The RCAF was caught in the politics of the cancellation. Air Marshal Campbell was accused of not fighting hard enough for the Arrow. Today, he is reluctant to get involved in the controversy again. But he has told us that contrary to statements made by the Prime Minister, the Chiefs of Staff did not make a recommendation to cancel the Arrow, and that he offered his resignation if the Arrow were cancelled without provision for an alternative fighter. The alternative was the Voodoo and the Beaumark, and the Beaumark was a failure. This model met the same fate as Arrow 206, lying a few meters away in the same warehouse. Whatever the Beaumark was, it was no replacement for the Arrow. There was still another reason offered by the government for the cancellation. They tried to sell the Arrow before it entered squadron service, and they found they couldn't.
Now, I went down to the United States in September and had conversations with their Secretary of Defense, find out whether they would be interested in our 105, see whether they'd be willing to purchase the 105 for even some of their squadrons. And the answer that I received was that they were not prepared at that time to do so.
Mr. Perks, I reiterate, is a gentleman. I have the highest regard for him as a person. But he was a permanent Army officer. He'd been retired from that for some time. He was over 70 years old, and he didn't know one end of an airplane from another. He had no appreciation of the industrial implications. He wasn't in a position to discuss the Arrow or any aspect of it.
And
there was another attempt to sell the Arrow. In the winter of 1958, Donald Fleming and two other ministers met with their American counterparts in Paris to discuss defense. Fleming told them that the future of the Arrow might depend on sales to the U.S. It was hardly a strong selling point.
At the conclusion of my statement, Mr. Robert Anderson, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, who was my opposite number in that committee, gave me the answer no. It was an unconditional, uncompromising, and final answer. It was the decision of the United States government not to purchase the Arrow. And that decision spelled the doom of the Arrow program.
Paul Hellyer, who later ran as a conservative, was Liberal defense critic in opposition in 1959, and he still maintains that the government did not make the right kind of effort to sell the Arrow.
I don't think the Arrow could have been sold to the United States directly because the United States Air Force has an almost iron rule. They never buy anything that isn't invented in the United States. But what they do, and what I think might have been done, is that they sometimes help finance sales to other allies. And it's my belief that if Mr. Howe, for example, had still been around, that he could have done something. At that time, Canadian real estate was still important to the United States. It's not now, but then it was. They had to count on us for the radar lines and for a number of other facilities, for refueling facilities and so on. And we had a lot of leverage. We had a lot of power at that time in negotiations. And I think someone like Mr. Howe could have said, all right, you won't buy it. This we understand, this we know. But we want your help in financing the sale of this aircraft to some of the other allies that you traditionally help. And with his kind of persuasion, I personally believe that it could have been done.
Yes, on balance, I think it could have been sold. When you look at the attempts of the French to sell Mirage fighters or other countries to sell weapon systems, you get the tremendous involvement, not only at the business level, but at the most senior political levels, where a prime minister or a president will go out to sell a program. I don't think in this country that we've a tradition of involving the senior political community in selling weapon systems. And I think if that kind of pressure had been applied in relation to the United States, where there was a gap in weapon systems that the Arrow could have filled, I think that could have been done. And it's a lesson we still have to learn, that if you're going to sell major programs, then you need major political effort in support of those programs.
The Arrow was the most sophisticated weapon system this country had ever created. Its performance, even in the curtailed flight tests, placed it among the best in the world. But the sales effort that went along with it was amateurish and tentative. And when that failed, the Arrow met an ugly fate. In April 1959, Ottawa sent instructions to destroy the 5 Arrows that had flown and all the work on the assembly line. Men who had worked to build the planes were now ordered to cut them to pieces. As to who issued the order, whether it came from cabinet or from a bureaucrat, no one is telling.
In Mr. Diefenbaker's memoir, I think he said that he was not aware of these instructions. But I was aware of them because I was the fellow who received them. And like an idiot, I folded. And so I'm the person that issued the instructions to destroy the airplanes. And that's the worst mistake I ever made in my life.
Cameramen were not allowed inside the plant to record the destruction. But one enterprising photographer rented a plane and took this series of aerial shots.
They were cut up with torches in the hangar there and hammered down with steel balls like they destroy buildings.
After the aircraft were dismantled, the pieces were sold to a Hamilton junk dealer for 6.5 cents per pound. At 67,000 pounds, a scrapped Arrow would have cost you $4,355. A few weeks earlier, a request for one or more of the Arrows had come from Britain for use in flight testing. The request was not refused. It was simply withdrawn, presumably on advice from Canada.
3 could have been flown to England with 2 more to be used as backup spares of the first 5 we had flying. Canada wouldn't let them go. I mean, the reason is obvious. Had those aeroplanes ever got to Farnborough, and Farnborough realized the fantastic performance, I mean, Diefenbaker in no way ever justified his cancellation of that program. And I'm sure that's why they were never let go.
Well, the 5 Arrows that had flown, and for which there was some interest on the part of the Royal Aeronautic Establishment in Britain. They wanted to take a couple of those and work further on research with them. Those were destroyed. Those were cut into scrap.
Well, I can't give you the detail now of the issues that went into the destruction of a particular copy. But I can tell you that in general, there was no deliberate destruction to do away with the Arrow. Far from it. It was just a case of what was the economical way of disposing at that particular time of various copies of the plane that were in various stages of production.
And as you know, what happened after that, it was just like a de-Stalinization program. We were ordered to destroy all film on all original negative film on the Avro, all the still pictures, black and white, all stuff that had been developed during the flight test phases of the airplane. Ottawa's instructions were to destroy these. They ordered us to destroy the aeroplanes by breaking them up. And I think the day I saw that production line being put to the cutting torch, it's the nearest I've come to shedding a tear over an aeroplane. It was pathetic.
Looking back on this extraordinary event, the scrapping of the Arrow still seems an act of either inspired malevolence or of criminal stupidity, a mocking epitaph to the work of the men and women who built her.
Did you see any aircraft being destroyed?
No. No. I could have if I wanted to, but I didn't. I couldn't. I don't think any people wanted to go and watch such a massacre. Frightening sight.
The people who are part of the Arrow story are now 21 years older. David Golden was then Deputy Minister of Defense Production. He is now the head of Telesat Canada, the satellite agency, and he has not changed his mind about whether cancelling the Arrow was the right thing to do.
It's not, in my view, something that one can be dogmatic about, but I would certainly come down on the side of saying, yes, painfully, regrettably, it was the right decision at the time under all the circumstances, and I think so now too.
Well, you've got to look at it from various points of view. You know, from the country's point of view, was it a mistake? I think that you really can't afford to abdicate from the thrust of technology. The airplane was a good airplane. It probably would have sold a hell of a lot of copies.
If you have to look at it strictly from the standpoint of defense, and the amount of defense dollars that the Arrow was going to take, then I don't really think that the government had any choice. Certainly, it would have taken all of the defense money that was then available. The Navy and the Army would have had nothing. They would have been totally bereft for years. And this, from their standpoint, I think was untenable. If you look at it from the national standpoint, in other words, you ignore the defense budget and say, what is the best thing for Canada, for our industrial base, for our scientific base, for our national base, our feeling of Canadianism, for the great things that we're capable of doing, then personally I think it was a disastrous decision.
Well, again, looking back, the enormous loss that we have endured in the people and in the technology, one wonders if it would not have perhaps been worth it to have accepted those higher costs at that day to retain that type of talent and technology here in Canada. But that's hindsight, and hindsight's 20/20 vision. And in those days, I don't think anyone really appreciated the impact, the enormous impact downstream, 10 years, 15 years later, of that decision.
And the consequences? One of them was a shot in the arm for the American Moon Project. A number of top engineers were immediately snapped up by NASA. Brian Erb, a young engineer, developed the heat shield for the Apollo spacecraft. Len Packham, in charge of the rocket test program with Avro, worked on the telemetry system for the first manned rocket launchings. And Jim Chamberlain, chief technician at Avro, was project director for Gemini and is now with McDonnell Douglas in Houston. Engineer Ken Cook went from Avro straight to McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis. He's now a systems engineer on the F-18, which his company hopes to sell to Canada for $2.5 billion. It seems the era of the manned interceptor is not over after all, but it's unlikely we'll ever have another Arrow. Shortly after the cancellation, we signed a defense production sharing agreement with the U.S., tacitly agreeing never again to undertake production of a major weapon system on our own. The question returns. Can a country the size of Canada ever compete in the business of building costly weapons of war?
The immediate impression is to say, no, you can't afford them. But when you look at Sweden, which has a third our population and which has an incredibly strong aircraft industry. They have managed to establish a strong defense program, a stable planned program, a very strong aircraft industry, and although they're in some difficulties now, they've done that for the last 20 or 30 years. So it simply is feasible if the planning and the purpose is there over a sufficiently long term.
But I think it's a characteristic of Canada. We really haven't learned to capitalize on the genius that we're able to create from time to time in this country. We don't support research and development. We go so far and then back off.
Canada can do it if it wants to be in that kind of business, if it wants to build its economy, if it wants to develop that sense of commitment, then we have all the other resources that are available to do it. The manpower, the finance, the marketing ability is all there in a native sense.
The end of the Arrow was to be the end of the company. It was also the end of Crawford Gordon. Sir Roy Dobson, wheeling and dealing to keep the company alive, fired the man he once thought of as a son and felt compelled to write a letter to John Diefenbaker to tell him so.
It's addressed to the Right Honorable John G. Diefenbaker. It begins, Dear Mr. Prime Minister, I sent word via Mr. Guest that I have asked for and received the resignation of Mr. Crawford Gordon as President of Avro Canada Limited on the grounds that I was most dissatisfied with the way he has been working and with his actions, which could not be considered to be in the best interest of the company or the country. It's signed by Sir Roy H. Dobson, by Roy H. Dobson.
8 years later, Crawford Gordon died in New York. His friends said he drank himself to death. He could handle success, but not failure. And what of the other personalities in the Arrow story? After the cancellation, James Floyd moved back to Britain. In a distinguished career, he saw 2 of his aeroplanes, both of them pioneering ventures, both canceled. He is now retired, still working as a consultant in the aviation industry and still a Canadian citizen. Fred Smyth bought an office equipment company, got tired of it, and in 1972 moved to Portugal. He is writing a book about Avro and the Arrow. He regards himself as being in voluntary exile. Jan Zurakowski retired a few months before the cancellation and now owns a fishing lodge in northeastern Ontario. The Arrow is long dead, but the controversy lives on with its memory. People still argue its merits. Was it as good, as great as its supporters would have us believe? Here are 3 answers.
If you mean by the Arrow, I take it, a fighting instrument of war, which must include an aircraft, an engine, and a sophisticated fire control system, then of course there never was an Arrow in those terms. I think everybody will agree that is factual. But I think it's a mistake and gets people somewhat worked up in a way that they ought not to talk about the cancellation of this great Canadian achievement when in fact it may very well have turned out to be a great achievement, but it seems to me that at the time it was canceled, it was too soon to say whether the hopes that everyone held out for it were going to be realized or were not.
Aircraft nowadays are maybe more sophisticated in this or that, and better engines, better fuel consumption, better pressure recoveries. But there's nothing that I know of that would, even now, today, be an improvement on that maneuverability capability.
It was absolute state of the art. It was a beautiful machine, and we probably would still be flying it today.
In losing the Arrow, we lost not only a symbol of national pride, we lost a technology and an immense pool of talent. There is one final question among the legacy of questions left by the death of the Arrow. To what extent did American interests influence the cancellation? The answer appears to be not at all. Although American space technology was the great beneficiary when the Arrow was killed, the United States did nothing to bring it about. They didn't have to. We did it all, ourselves.
Controls are behaving quite nicely. I can see no oscillatory motions of any description in them.
I think all this, the militant carriage is packed, all the vibration disappears. I think the carriage is making this.
That's right, it's the side door which is making. The door which comes and closes the undercarriage in doing is hitting against the fuselage. Behaving quite nicely. They are occasionally giving you a bit of a black puff of smoke coming out of them, Jan, but otherwise I can see there is no problem.
Frank, I think it's still got a bit less 1.5 degree. So the side slip to right.
That is Roger, Jan. As far as I can see from the back, no condition has changed.
Switching out the dampers now.
Fuel readings, please, 201. The wind is northeast at 10, the altimeter is 020, and your number 1 for 32. Telemetry is touchdown.